Geography. A fortress of stone and whispers. The phone screen dims beside your pillow, and with it, the last tether to today's endless demands. You've earned this moment of stillness, though I suspect your mind hasn't quite received that message yet. The weight you're carrying doesn't simply vanish when you close your eyes, does it? Those decisions waiting for tomorrow, the conversations you're rehearsing, the careful calculations that dance behind your eyelids, they're all still there, aren't they? Tonight, I want to take you somewhere far from the glow of notifications and the whisper of anxiety. Somewhere built to endure, where stone walls have absorbed centuries of human ambition, triumph, and quiet desperation. A place where others, much like yourself, once carried the weight of impossible choices and found ways to bear them with grace. Picture, if you will, the jagged spine of the Pyrenees, where France meets Spain in a collision of granite peaks and ancient valleys. Here, where eagles circle thermal currents and morning mist clings to slopes carpeted in oak and chestnut, stands one of Europe's most remarkable fortresses. Fort Liberia rises from the mountainside like a stone crown, its walls following the natural contours of the rock, as if the mountain itself had dreamed it into being. From the valley below, the fortress appears almost organic, a natural extension of the cliff face, weathered to the same silver gray as the surrounding stone. But climb closer, and you begin to appreciate the audacious human vision that carved this stronghold from the living rock. Every angle calculated, every wall positioned with mathematical precision. This is no mere castle built for show. This is a masterpiece of military engineering, designed by minds that understood both the art of war and the weight of protecting what matters most. The locals have always called it La forteresse qui dévorait l'or, the fortress that devoured gold, a name whispered with equal parts admiration and unease, for they understood, as perhaps you do, the terrible arithmetic of building something meant to last, the cost of true strength, measured not just in coin, but in sleepless nights and impossible choices. Fort Liberia was born from the mind of Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban, the Sun King's master of fortifications, a man who understood, perhaps better than any military engineer before or since, that true security comes not from walls alone, but from the careful orchestration of geography, psychology, and human nature. Vauban looked at this mountainside and saw not just stone and slope, but possibility. The chance to create something that would endure long after the immediate threats had faded into history. Construction began in the 1680s, during those restless years when Europe's borders shifted like storm clouds. Every block of stone was quarried from the mountain itself, hauled up impossible slopes by teams of oxen and the calloused hands of stonemasons who understood their craft as both art and prayer. They worked through seasons of alpine wind and summer heat, laying foundations that would need to bear not just the weight of walls, but the weight of centuries. Imagine the master builder standing on these heights as dawn breaks across the Pyrenees, his breath visible in the mountain air, hands wrapped around a cup of something warm, eyes tracing the fortress walls that exist only in his mind's eye. He carries the weight of the king's expectations, the safety of a frontier, the livelihoods of hundreds of craftsmen. Not so different from the weight you carry, really. The same fundamental challenge that faces anyone who builds something meant to matter. How do you balance vision with reality, ambition with wisdom, the urgent with the enduring? The fortress that emerged from their labors was unlike anything Europe had seen. Not content with simple walls and towers, Vauban's design carved deep into the mountain itself. Tunnels and galleries honeycomb the rock beneath the visible fortress, a hidden world of passages, chambers, and stairways that spiral down into the mountain's heart. Here, in these stone arteries, soldiers could move unseen. Supplies could be stored beyond the reach of siege engines, and the fortress could continue to breathe even when its surface was under assault. Walking these passages today, and we will walk them together before our journey ends. You feel the weight of the mountain above you, the solid presence of stone that has weathered centuries of storm and siege. The air carries a peculiar stillness, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through hidden ventilation shafts. It's a place that invites contemplation, where the urgent anxieties of daily life seem to settle into something more manageable, more contained. But Fort Liberia was never just about military strategy. It was about something deeper, something that speaks to the heart of what you're building in your own life. It was about creating a place where people could feel secure enough to think beyond survival, to plan, to hope, to invest in tomorrow. The fortress protected not just bodies, but the space for human flourishing. Markets could operate in its shadow. Families could put down roots. Craftsmen could perfect their trades across generations. The view from Fort Liberia's highest ramparts encompasses a landscape that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires. To the south, the Pyrenees march toward the Mediterranean in an endless procession of peaks and valleys. To the north, gentler hills roll toward the heart of France, their slopes checkered with vineyards and villages that have grown and prospered under the fortress's watchful protection. On clear days, you can see for 50 miles in any direction. A reminder that true leadership requires both immediate focus and distant vision. The fortress walls themselves tell stories in their weathered stone. Here, a section rebuilt after the siege of 1793, when revolutionary fervor tested Vauban's engineering against human desperation. There, subtle differences in masonry that mark repairs made during the Napoleonic Wars, when the fortress changed hands multiple times and each new garrison left its mark. These aren't scars. They're evidence of resilience, proof that what is built with wisdom can adapt, endure, and emerge stronger. Standing here in the gathering dusk, for evening comes early to these mountain heights, you begin to understand why the fortress earned its nickname. The gold it devoured wasn't just the king's treasury, though the costs were indeed staggering. It was the more precious currency of human dedication, the countless hours of craftsmen who understood they were building something larger than themselves. The sleepless nights of engineers calculating stress loads and angles of fire, the patient accumulation of supplies and expertise that would allow this place to fulfill its purpose when the moment came. But here's what strikes you most powerfully about Fort Liberia, what makes it more than just an impressive example of military architecture. It's the sense of quiet confidence that permeates these stones. This was built by people who understood that true strength comes not from the ability to attack, but from the wisdom to create something worth defending. They weren't building out of fear or desperation, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what needed to be done and the patience to do it properly. The fortress succeeded not because it was impregnable. No fortress truly is, but because it represented something larger than itself. It was a statement of commitment, a promise that this place, these people, this way of life, was worth the investment of treasure and time and human ingenuity. When enemies approached these walls, they weren't just facing stone and cannon. They were confronting the accumulated will of generations who had chosen to build rather than merely survive. As night settles over the Pyrenees and the first stars appear above the fortress walls, you can almost hear the whispers of all those who have walked these ramparts before you, soldiers keeping watch through long winter nights, their breath visible in the mountain air as they contemplated the valleys below. Engineers making final adjustments to cannon emplacements, their minds calculating trajectories and powder charges. Commanders weighing intelligence reports by candlelight, making decisions that would ripple across borders and decades. But also quieter voices. The fortress baker, rising before dawn to feed the garrison, finding satisfaction in the simple alchemy of flour and fire. The master gunner, teaching young soldiers not just the mechanics of artillery, but the responsibility that comes with such power. The chaplain, offering comfort to homesick men far from their villages, understanding that courage requires not the absence of fear, but the presence of something worth fearing for. These walls have absorbed centuries of human ambition, disappointment, triumph, and quiet perseverance. They've sheltered those who carried weights perhaps not so different from yours. The burden of responsibility, the pressure of expectations, the lonely mathematics of leadership where every decision carries consequences you can't fully foresee. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your own refuge, remember that you're part of an ancient fellowship, those who have chosen to build something meant to endure, who carry the weight of tomorrow's possibilities along with today's demands. Fort Liberia stands as proof that such burdens, properly borne, can create something beautiful and lasting. The mountain wind whispers through the fortress walls now, carrying with it the promise of stories, yet untold, of the people who lived and worked and dreamed within these stone chambers, and of the lessons they learned about bearing weight with grace. But we're only beginning to explore the depths of what this fortress holds. In the chambers beneath our feet lie tales of ingenuity and desperation, of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary reserves of strength when circumstances demanded it. Stories that might just illuminate something about the weight you carry, and the fortress you're building in your own life. The architect and the mountain. Let me take you deeper into those chambers, where the story of one man's impossible vision begins to unfold. Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban. Even his name carries weight, doesn't it? The king's marshal, the master of fortifications, the man who would reshape the very borders of France with stone and mortar, and an unshakable belief that the impossible was simply the untried. Picture him in 1679, standing on this wind-swept ridge for the first time. Not yet the fortress you might imagine, but raw Pyrenean stone and stubborn mountain grass, with the Spanish border stretching away like a challenge written in the landscape itself. At 66, Vauban had already built more fortresses than most men could count. But this would be different. This would be his masterpiece carved into the heavens themselves. The weight he carried that day, can you feel it? The king's expectations pressing down like the mountain air itself. Louis XIV didn't simply want another fort. He wanted a statement, a declaration in stone that French power could reach anywhere, could tame anything, could make the impossible bow to royal will. And Vauban, the architect of the impossible, had said yes. But standing there, feeling the wind that had carved these peaks for millennia, even Vauban must have wondered what he had committed himself to. How do you build a fortress in the clouds? How do you transport cannon up slopes that make pack mules stumble? How do you convince stone to hold against not just enemy fire, but the very mountain that wants to shrug it off like snow? The plans he drew that winter, they exist still, in archives that smell of old leather and ambition. Precise lines marking walls that would rise 300 feet above the valley floor. Calculations for bastions that would jut from the cliff face like the mountain's own defiant gesture. Every angle measured not just for fields of fire, but for the way wind would move around the walls, the way rain would run off the ramparts, the way morning light would reveal approaching enemies while keeping defenders in shadow. This is what true vision looks like. Not just seeing what could be, but understanding every detail of how it must be built. Every stone mapped before the first cart began its impossible journey up the mountain. Every timber calculated before the first tree fell in the valleys below. Vauban knew that dreams without details remain dreams, that the weight of leadership isn't carried in grand gestures, but in 10,000 small decisions made correctly, one after another, until the impossible stands solid against the sky. And then came the moment when planning had to become reality. When lines on paper had to transform into tons of granite and limestone hauled up slopes that had never known such ambition. This is where Jean-André de Villemur enters our story. The man who would take Vauban's vision and somehow, impossibly, make it real. Villemur, a name history barely remembers, but without him, Fort Liberia would have remained beautiful drawings in a royal archive. He was what we might call today a project manager, though that pale term hardly captures what he faced. Imagine trying to coordinate a construction project where every nail, every beam, every block of stone had to be carried up a mountain by men and mules working against gravity, weather, and their own exhaustion. The logistics alone would have broken lesser minds. Limestone quarried in the valleys below, each block cut to Vauban's precise specifications, then loaded onto carts that groaned under weight they were never designed to carry. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a goat track widened by desperate men with picks and shovels. Switchbacks carved into living rock, each turn a compromise between engineering possibility and mountain stubbornness. Picture those early mornings, mist still clinging to the peaks when the supply trains began their daily battle with the mountain. 40, 50 carts at a time, each one loaded with stone that had been shaped in the valley workshops through the long winter months. The drivers knew every loose stone on that track, every place where the path narrowed to barely more than cart width, every turn where a moment's inattention could send months of work tumbling into the abyss below. And the weather. The Pyrenees don't surrender their secrets gently. Spring brought mudslides that could bury a week's progress in a single night. Summer storms that turned the mountain track into a river of loose stone and desperate hope. Winter. Winter stopped everything. For months at a time, the fortress-to-be would stand half-finished against the snow, while down in the valley, Villemur planned and calculated and worried through the dark months. But perhaps the greatest challenge wasn't the mountain or the weather, or even the sheer audacious scale of what they were attempting. It was the men themselves. How do you convince stonemasons to work at heights that make eagles nervous? How do you keep morale alive when every day's work feels like a grain of sand against an ocean of stone still to be laid? Villemur understood something that modern leaders sometimes forget, that great projects aren't built by grand speeches or royal decrees. They're built by men who show up each morning despite the impossibility, who place one stone carefully upon another, who trust that their small part matters even when they can't see the whole. He made sure the workers were fed well, paid fairly, and, most importantly, that they understood they were building something that would outlast empires. The engineering challenges would have tested even modern construction techniques. Foundation stones had to be set directly into the mountain itself, carved seats in the living rock that would hold walls designed to bear the weight of cannon and the fury of siege warfare. Each foundation stone weighed more than 3 men could lift, positioned with tolerances measured in fractions of inches because Vauban knew that imprecision at the foundation would multiply into catastrophe at the ramparts. The mortar alone was a masterpiece of medieval chemistry. Not just lime and sand, but recipes passed down through generations of fortress builders, adjusted for mountain conditions that no textbook had ever described. Mix it too wet, and the mountain cold would freeze it before it could set. Too dry, and it would crumble under the weight of the stones above. Villemour's masons learned to read the weather like farmers, timing each day's work to the rhythm of temperature and humidity that could make or break months of progress. And always, always, the awareness that they were building not just for today's war, but for conflicts not yet imagined. Vauban's genius lay in understanding that fortifications must evolve, must adapt, must be ready for weapons that hadn't been invented yet. So the walls rose with hidden chambers for future modifications, with sight lines calculated for cannon that were still in the foundries, with supply routes planned for sieges that might last years. The first winter they worked through, that was when the mountain truly tested their resolve. Supplies frozen solid in the carts, mortar that had to be mixed indoors and rushed to the walls before the cold could steal its strength. Men working in shifts around braziers that barely kept their tools from freezing to their hands. But Villemour had learned something crucial from Vauban himself, that the weight of impossible projects isn't carried all at once, but one day at a time, one stone at a time, one decision at a time made correctly, despite the doubt. By the second year, something remarkable had happened. The fortress had begun to look inevitable, as if the mountain itself had always intended these walls to rise from its bones. Travelers on the valley roads below would stop and stare upward at the growing silhouette against the sky, wondering how human ambition had managed to take root in such impossible soil. But Vauban, visiting the site as walls finally began to reach toward their planned heights, understood something his admirers couldn't see. The true fortress wasn't the stone and mortar rising against the Pyrenean sky. It was the network of skills, relationships, and hard-won knowledge that had made the impossible possible. The masons who had learned to work at heights that defied reason. The supply chains that had turned mountain goat tracks into highways of ambition. The trust between men who had shared the weight of something larger than themselves. This is what real building looks like. Not just the visible structure, but the invisible architecture of competence and commitment that makes the visible possible. The fortress you're building in your own life, the weight you carry each day. It's being constructed with the same patient accumulation of small victories, the same refusal to let the impossible remain untested. As night settles deeper around us here in these ancient chambers, you can almost hear the echoes, the ring of hammers on stone, the creak of cartwheels on impossible roads, the quiet satisfaction of men who showed up each day to build something that would outlast their own names. They carried their weight, stone by stone, until the mountain itself became their monument. The 1,000 steps, a descent into shadow. And yet, beneath their feet as they worked, another marvel was taking shape. A secret that would burrow deep into the mountain's heart. A passage that would test the limits of human endurance and engineering ambition. The 1,000 steps. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're building something that seems impossible, and you realize the real challenge isn't the grand vision everyone can see. It's the hidden infrastructure, the systems no one will ever notice, but without which everything else would crumble. The protocols you establish at 3 in the morning, the relationships you nurture in quiet moments, the escape routes you hope never to need. Picture, if you will, a staircase carved from living rock. Not the polished marble of palaces or the worn stone steps of ancient temples. This was something far more raw, more desperate. 1,000 individual steps, each one chiseled by hand from the mountain's stubborn granite, descending in darkness, spiraling down through passages so narrow that 2 men could barely pass. A lifeline tunneled through solid stone. The idea came from necessity, as the best ideas often do. Villemur understood that a fortress, no matter how magnificent, was only as strong as its ability to endure siege, and siege meant isolation. Cut off from the world above, the garrison would need water, supplies, communication with the valley below. But more than that, they would need hope. The knowledge that they were not entirely trapped within their mountain stronghold. So began one of the most audacious engineering projects of the age. A secret passage that would connect the fortress chambers to the world beyond, emerging nearly a kilometer away in the valley below. Hidden among the rocks and scrubland where no enemy would think to look. The 1,000 steps would be their umbilical cord to survival. The work began in winter, when the mountain showed its cruelest face. Teams of miners and stonemasons descended into passages lit only by flickering torches, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Each step had to be measured precisely. Too steep, and men carrying supplies would stumble in the darkness. Too shallow, and the passage would stretch on forever, vulnerable to collapse. Listen to the rhythm of their tools, the steady percussion of hammers against chisels, echoing through chambers that had never known light. Tap, 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 like a heartbeat in the mountain's chest. Each strike removing another fragment of stone, another small victory against the impossible. There was Claude Mercier, a stonemason from Lyon, whose hands could read granite like a book. He could tell you where the rock would split clean and where it would fight back, sending shards flying to cut unwary faces. Claude worked by touch as much as sight in those narrow passages, running calloused fingers along the stone face to find the natural lines of weakness. He was building something he would never see completed, carving steps his own feet might never descend. In the flickering torchlight, you could watch him work with the patience of mountains themselves. Each step required dozens of careful cuts. First, the rough shape hewn from solid rock. Then, the gradual refinement, smoothing the surface just enough for safe footing, but not so much that precious time was wasted on unnecessary beauty. This was function in its purest form. Survival, carved in stone. The younger men grew restless in those depths. The darkness pressed against them like a living thing, and the air grew thin in the deepest passages. But Claude understood something they were still learning, that the weight you carry becomes lighter when you focus not on the mountain still ahead, but on the single step beneath your hands. "One stone at a time," he would murmur in his thick lion accent. "The mountain doesn't care about our hurry." As weeks turned to months, the passage began to take on a life of its own. Word spread through the construction camps about the secret stairway growing beneath their feet. Men would volunteer for the underground shifts, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the knowledge that they were creating something truly hidden, truly theirs. A secret the mountain would keep. The work attracted a particular kind of person, those who didn't mind the darkness, who found peace in the steady rhythm of stone against steel. Men like Henri Dubois, a former soldier who had seen too much of war's bright violence and found solace in the mountain's depths. Down there, in passages lit only by torch flame, the world's chaos seemed very far away. Henri would descend each morning as the sun touched the fortress walls above, carrying his tools and a small flask of wine that would last him through the day. He had learned to read the mountain's moods, when the rock was brittle from frost, when underground springs made the passages treacherous with ice. His section of the stairway became known for its perfect regularity, each step exactly the right height and depth for a man carrying supplies in darkness. You understand this, don't you? The strange comfort of work that demands everything from you. When the challenge is so complete that there's no room for the anxieties that usually crowd your thoughts, no space for worry about tomorrow's meetings or next month's numbers. Just you, your tools, and the immediate problem of the stone before you. The passage grew deeper, following the mountain's hidden geometry. Sometimes they encountered underground streams that had to be diverted with careful stonework. Other times, pockets of softer rock that crumbled at a touch, requiring timber supports hauled down from the surface. Each challenge was solved with the same methodical patience that characterized everything about Fort Liberia's construction. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that tested them. The psychological weight of working so far underground, so removed from sun and sky, began to tell on even the strongest men. Some developed a peculiar claustrophobia that had nothing to do with small spaces and everything to do with being buried alive in their own ambitions. The wise ones, like Claude and Henri, learned to carry light within themselves. They would share stories as they worked, voices echoing strangely in the narrow passages, tales of home, of families waiting in distant villages, of the lives they would return to when this impossible project was finally complete. The stories became as important as the stonework, another kind of architecture, built from words and shared purpose. There was Marie-Claire, Henri's daughter, who sent letters that reached him even in these depths. She was learning to read, and her carefully formed words about village life and changing seasons became treasures more precious than gold. Henri would read them aloud by torchlight, and other men would listen as if hearing news from another world entirely. As the staircase descended deeper into the mountain's heart, it began to reveal secrets of its own. Ancient caves that had never known human presence. Formations of crystal that caught the torchlight like trapped stars. Underground chambers where the only sound was the slow drip of water that had been falling in darkness since before recorded history. These discoveries became waypoints in their descent. The Chamber of Echoes, where a whisper would return 7 times before fading. The Crystal Gallery, where men would pause despite their exhaustion just to hold torches high and watch light dance across mineral formations. The Deep Pool, where spring water collected in perfect stillness, reflecting torch flames like a mirror made of night itself. Each of these places became part of the stairway's character, landmarks in a journey through the mountain's hidden geography. Men would measure their progress not just by the number of steps carved, but by these natural monuments encountered along the way. The work developed its own rhythm, its own culture. Day shift and night shift, each team taking pride in their section of the passage. Competition, but friendly. Who could maintain the most consistent step height? Whose stonework would wear best under the constant traffic of feet? They were building something that might need to save lives someday, and that knowledge infused every hammer blow with purpose. As autumn deepened into winter, the passage had descended far enough that men working at the bottom could no longer see even the faintest glow from the entrance above. They worked in complete dependence on torch and candle, in air that grew thinner with each level down. Yet somehow, this only increased their sense of shared purpose. They were no longer just building a staircase. They were creating a lifeline, a secret artery through which hope itself could flow. When the fortress was complete, and garrison soldiers walked these steps in times of siege, They would follow paths carved by men who understood what it meant to descend into darkness in service of something larger than themselves. The 1,000 steps became a meditation on endurance, on the quiet heroism of showing up each day to chip away at the impossible. Stone by stone, step by step, they were proving that mountains could be moved, not through force or speed, but through the accumulated weight of countless small actions performed with care and carried forward by faith. Down in those depths, where torch flame was the only light and the sound of hammers the only music, they were learning what you know in your own way, that the most important work often happens in darkness, unseen by the world above, but essential to everything that stands in the light. And still, the staircase descended, carrying with it the dreams and determination of men who refused to let stone have the final word. Life within the walls. And as those stone steps found their rhythm, carved deeper each day into the mountain's heart, life above ground settled into its own patterns. Patterns that would define what it meant to live within walls of stone, suspended between earth and sky. Picture, if you will, the first light of dawn touching the fortress walls. Not the gentle sunrise you might see from your office window, but something harder, more immediate. The sun here struck stone first, then flesh. And in that moment, when light met the eastern battlements, Fort Liberia would stir to life with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, yet with all the messy humanity that no engineer could ever truly plan for. The day began with bells, not church bells calling the faithful to prayer, but the harsh bronze voice of military necessity, 5 in the morning, without fail, cutting through whatever dreams the garrison might have been nursing. And in those first moments after waking, each man faced the same reality you know well: the weight of another day, another set of responsibilities that couldn't be delegated or delayed. Captain Francois Moreau had been at Fort Liberia for 3 years by then, long enough to know every stone in the courtyard, every echo that bounced off the walls when the wind picked up from the valley below. He would rise before the bell, as leaders do, standing at his narrow window, looking out over ramparts that stretched into morning mist, calculating the day ahead. There were always calculations. How many men were fit for duty? How much powder remained in the magazines? Were the supply wagons from Perpignan on schedule, or would they face another week of rationed bread and watered wine? The same mental arithmetic you perform each morning, except his miscalculations might mean starvation, while yours might mean missing payroll. But leadership, as you know, isn't just about the large decisions. It's about the 1,000 small choices that create the texture of daily life. And within these walls, that texture was everything. The fortress kitchens came alive with the controlled chaos of feeding 200 souls. Master cook Bernard Rousseau commanded his domain with the authority of a general and the creativity of an artist working with impossibly limited materials. Salt pork, dried beans, flour that had traveled hundreds of miles in ox carts, transforming scarcity into something approaching nourishment. Day after day after day. You can almost smell it, can't you? The wood smoke mixing with herbs that grew wild on the mountainside. Thyme and rosemary, gathered by the younger soldiers during their off-duty hours. Small freedoms within larger constraints. The kind of adaptation that happens when people refuse to let circumstances define the boundaries of their humanity. The sounds told their own story. The scrape of wooden spoons against iron pots, the rhythmic thud of bread being kneaded on flour-dusted tables, and underneath it all, the constant murmur of conversation. Men sharing news from letters that had arrived with the last supply train, debating whether the political situation in Paris would affect their next rotation, wondering aloud about families they hadn't seen in months. Community forms in unexpected ways when people are pressed together by necessity. Not the easy camaraderie of choosing to be together, but something deeper. The recognition that survival depends on the person standing next to you, whether you particularly like them or not. Take Sergeant Michel Dubois. No relation to Henri, the stone carver, though they shared that particular stubbornness that seemed to run in the name. Michel had been a blacksmith before the army claimed him, and his hands still carried the memory of working iron. Now he worked with men instead of metal, shaping discipline from raw recruits, tempering courage in boys who had never been further than the next village. His workshop occupied a corner of the main courtyard, and throughout the day, the ring of his hammer provided a steady counterpoint to fortress life. Sharpening swords, mending buckles, crafting the 100 small metal things that keep an isolated community functioning. But more than that, offering a place where men could gather, ostensibly to watch him work, actually to share the burdens they couldn't quite name. "Iron tells you when it's ready," he would say, heating a bent sword in his forge. "Push too hard, too fast, and it breaks. Not hard enough, and it stays weak." The younger soldiers thought he was talking about metalwork. The older ones understood he was describing something else entirely. The patience required to build anything that lasts, and patience was perhaps the fortress's greatest requirement. Not the dramatic patience of waiting for battle, but the grinding, daily patience of living within limits. Limits of space, of privacy, of choice. The kind of constraints that either break people or teach them what they're truly made of. The sleeping quarters told this story most clearly. Imagine rooms designed for efficiency, not comfort. Stone walls that wept moisture in winter and trapped heat in summer. Narrow windows that offered glimpses of the world beyond, but never enough light for reading. Straw mattresses that rustled with every movement, making private thoughts public in the darkness. Yet even here, humanity asserted itself. Personal belongings arranged with military precision, yes, but also with individual touches that spoke of lives lived before these walls. A wooden comb carved with initials. A letter read so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. A small knife with a bone handle, inherited from a father who had never seen a mountain, much less a fortress. Private Laurent Mercier, cousin to Claude, the stone carver, had brought with him a small wooden flute. Nothing elaborate, just a simple instrument his grandfather had made from apple wood. In the evenings, when duties were done and the fortress settled into its quieter rhythms, he would sometimes play. Soft melodies that drifted through the corridors, reminding everyone that beauty could exist even here, even now. Music in a fortress serves a different purpose than music in a palace. It's not entertainment, it's medicine. A reminder that the human spirit can create something lovely, even when surrounded by walls built for war. Those simple tunes carried men's thoughts beyond stone and mortar, back to villages where church bells marked time differently, where the horizon wasn't defined by battlements. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about life within these walls was how ordinary it became. How quickly the extraordinary circumstances of living in a mountain fortress transformed into routine. Morning inspections, afternoon drills, evening meals, the rhythm of days that blurred together until men could navigate every corridor in darkness, anticipate every bugle call, predict exactly how the light would fall across the courtyard at any hour. This is something you understand, isn't it? How the impossible gradually becomes simply difficult, then merely challenging, then just life. How what once seemed insurmountable transforms into the familiar weight you carry each day, no longer questioning whether you can bear it, only how best to distribute its pressure. The fortress chapel occupied a space carved directly into the mountain itself. Not grand like the cathedrals these men might have known in their youth, but intimate in a way that perhaps served better. Here, faith wasn't about soaring architecture or elaborate ceremony. It was about finding something steady to hold on to when everything else shifted like sand. Father Antoine conducted services by candlelight, his voice echoing off stone walls that seemed to hold every prayer ever spoken within them. But his real ministry happened in the quiet conversations afterward, listening to confessions that had less to do with sin than with fear, doubt, homesickness, and the peculiar guilt that comes from being safe, while others face danger. God doesn't ask us to carry more than we can bear, he would say, though privately he wondered if that was always true. What he knew for certain was that strength often came not from individual resilience, but from the willingness to share the load, to let others help carry what seemed too heavy for one person alone. The infirmary, small as it was, became another kind of sanctuary. Dr. Philippe Moreau, no relation to the captain, despite the shared name, tended not just to broken bones and fever, but to the subtler injuries that isolation inflicts, the melancholy that settled over men like morning mist, the restlessness that came from too much routine and too little change, the particular exhaustion that results from being always alert, always ready, in a place where nothing ever quite happened. His remedies were often surprisingly simple. A few days of different duties for someone growing stale in routine. Permission to walk the outer walls alone for a man who craved solitude. Extra rations for soldiers whose bodies were burning energy faster than their minds could account for. Small adjustments that acknowledged the human need for variety within structure, for choice within constraint. As afternoon light slanted through the fortress, casting long shadows across the courtyard, you could see how people had adapted not just to living within walls, but to living well within them. Gardens tucked into corners where soil could be coaxed to hold, workshops where men pursued crafts that had nothing to do with military necessity, but everything to do with human creativity. Quiet spaces where letters could be written, thoughts could be gathered, and the soul could find a moment's rest. And always, underneath the daily rhythms of fortress life, the sound of hammers continued from below, where the stone carvers worked their patient magic, creating the hidden passages that would ensure this community could endure whatever siege might come. The weight they all carried, soldiers, craftsmen, leaders, wasn't just the weight of duty or survival. It was the weight of building something larger than themselves, something that would outlast their individual lives and serve purposes they might never fully understand. Not unlike what you're building, in your own way, with your own tools, against your own particular mountain. In the gathering dusk, as cooking fires were banked and evening watch was set, Fort Liberia settled into the profound quiet that comes only to places where people have learned to live with purpose and with each other. Echoes of labor. But in those quiet moments, when the fortress breathed with the rhythm of settled routine, there were other stories being written in stone and sweat. Stories that rarely found their way into the official dispatches to Versailles. Stories of the men whose names would never grace any monument, yet whose hands shaped every stone of this mountain citadel. They came from villages scattered across the valleys below, farmers whose fields had failed, younger sons with no inheritance, men fleeing debts or disappointments, or simply the grinding poverty that marked so many lives in those uncertain times. They arrived at the base of the mountain with little more than strong backs, and the desperate hope that honest labor might lead to something better. Pierre Roussel had walked 3 days from his village near Perpignan, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. The harvest had been poor for the 3rd year running, and the tax collectors showed no mercy for empty granaries. When word reached his village that the king's fortress needed men, willing to work for steady wages and daily bread, Pierre kissed his family goodbye and joined the stream of laborers heading toward the mountain. He was 32 years old and had never been more than a day's walk from the place he was born. The sight of Fort Liberia, perched impossibly high above the valley, filled him with something between wonder and dread. How could men build such a thing? How could he, who had never lifted anything heavier than a plow, contribute to something so vast? The answer came with the dawn bell and the slow procession up the mountain paths, carrying stones, always carrying stones. Limestone blocks that had been quarried from the mountain's own flesh, each one requiring 2 men to lift, 4 men to maneuver up the narrow switchbacks. Day after day, step by careful step, building the fortress one burden at a time. The work was harder than anything Pierre had known. His hands, accustomed to the familiar calluses of farm work, developed new layers of roughness from rope and stone. His shoulders ached with a deep, persistent pain that seemed to settle into his very bones. But there was something else, too, something he hadn't expected. There was pride in the weight. Each stone they carried became part of something larger than any individual life. Each careful placement added to a structure that would stand for centuries. In the evening, when the work was done, and they sat around their simple fires, Pierre would look up at the growing walls and think of his children. Someday, perhaps, they might see this place. They might point to these stones and know that their father's hands had placed them here. The laborers developed their own rhythms, their own songs to match the cadence of their steps, simple melodies that helped synchronize their movements as they carried the heavier blocks, wordless chants that made the burden feel somehow lighter when shared among many voices. Jacques Moreau, a blacksmith's apprentice from Toulouse, had a voice that carried well in the thin mountain air. He would start the songs that helped them through the longest days, melodies that seemed to rise from the stone itself. "Lift together, brothers," he would sing, step by step, stone by stone. And 40 voices would join him, creating something beautiful from the simple act of shared labor. But the mountain took its toll. Men fell ill from the altitude and the constant exposure to wind and weather. Others were injured when ropes snapped or footing gave way on the treacherous paths. Some simply couldn't bear the isolation, the distance from families and familiar places, and they would disappear one morning, walking back down the mountain toward whatever life they had left behind. For every man who departed, another would arrive. The fortress seemed to draw them, these men seeking something more than mere survival. Perhaps it was the wages, better than anything they could earn in the valleys below. Perhaps it was the promise of steady work in uncertain times. Or perhaps it was something deeper, the chance to be part of something that mattered, something that would endure. Thomas Blanchard arrived in the 2nd year of construction, a young man barely 18 whose father had died in a mill accident. He had walked from Narbonne with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce determination to prove himself capable of more than anyone expected. The other laborers took him under their protection, teaching him the careful techniques for moving heavy stones without injury, showing him how to read the mountain's moods and weather patterns. Thomas learned to tie knots that would hold under impossible strain, learned to judge the balance point of irregularly shaped blocks, learned to work as part of something larger than himself. In the evenings, by firelight, the older men would share stories of their villages, their families, their dreams for what they might do when the fortress was complete. Thomas listened with the intensity of youth, absorbing not just their words, but their quiet wisdom about endurance, about finding meaning in difficult work, about the strange brotherhood that develops among men who share the same burdens. "This mountain changes you," old Henri Dubois told him one night, gesturing toward the growing walls that seemed to glow in the moonlight. "You come here thinking you're just moving stones. But the stones move something in you too. You become part of what you're building." Thomas understood. Each day, as he carried his share of the mountain's weight, he felt himself growing stronger. Not just in body, but in spirit. There was something profound about contributing to a work that would outlast his own life, about knowing that his efforts were woven into something permanent and important. The seasons turned, and the laborers learned to read the mountain's rhythms as intimately as any sailor reads the sea. They knew which paths became treacherous in rain, which winds signaled approaching storms, which times of day offered the clearest light for the most delicate work. They developed an almost mystical connection to the stone itself, understanding how limestone behaved in different weather, how to split it cleanly, how to fit irregular pieces together with the precision of a master craftsman. But perhaps their greatest achievement was simpler and more profound than any engineering marvel. They created community in a place that should have been impossibly isolated. They found ways to celebrate small victories, a particularly challenging stone successfully placed, a dangerous path completed without injury, news from home that reached the mountain through traveling merchants. They shared their meager possessions with the generosity of men who understood that survival depended on mutual support. When Pierre Roussel received word that his wife had given birth to their third child, the entire camp celebrated as if the baby belonged to all of them. When young Thomas injured his back and couldn't work for a week, his wages were quietly supplemented by contributions from men who could barely afford their own necessities. They were building more than a fortress. They were proving something essential about human nature. That even in the most challenging circumstances, people can create meaning, purpose, and connection. That the weight becomes bearable when it's truly shared. Years passed. The fortress grew from foundation stones to towering walls to completed bastions that commanded the entire valley. Some of the original laborers remained throughout the construction, becoming informal leaders who trained newcomers and maintained the traditions that made the work possible. Others moved on to other projects, carrying with them the skills and confidence they had gained on this impossible mountain. Pierre Roussel eventually returned to his village, his savings enough to buy better land and secure his family's future. But he carried something else with him. A quiet pride in what he had helped create, a deeper understanding of his own capabilities. He would tell his children about the fortress, about the stones he had carried and placed, about the brotherhood he had found among men who shared a common purpose. Thomas Blanchard became a master mason, his skills honed by years of working with the mountain stone. He would go on to build churches and bridges, always carrying with him the lessons learned in the thin air above the valley. Patience, precision, and the profound satisfaction that comes from creating something meant to last. Tonight, centuries later, their names are forgotten. No plaques commemorate their individual contributions. No histories record their personal struggles or small triumphs. But their legacy endures in every stone of Fort Liberia, in every wall that has withstood the mountain's fierce winds and the passage of countless seasons. They understood something that you, lying here in the darkness, wrestling with your own burdens, might recognize. That the work itself becomes sacred when it serves something larger than personal ambition, that the weight becomes bearable when it's carried with purpose, that what we build together can outlast any individual struggle or temporary setback. The mountain remembers their labor, even if the world has forgotten their names. And perhaps that's enough, to know that your efforts, your daily choices to carry the weight and continue building, become part of something that will endure long after the immediate pressures have faded into history. The fortress sleeps, and so the centuries turned, as they always do, carrying away the urgent voices of engineers and the daily concerns of soldiers, leaving behind only the stones and the silence they guard. Today, Fort Liberia stands as it has for 300 years, though now the cannons point toward nothing more threatening than tourists with cameras and hikers following the ancient paths that wind up from Villefranche-de-Conflans below. The fortress has become what all great works eventually become, a monument to human persistence, a testament to the possibility of building something that outlasts the builders themselves. The morning sun still strikes the eastern walls, as it did when Jean-André de Villemur first watched it rise over his impossible construction site. The same light that once illuminated the careful work of stone carvers and the patient efforts of countless laborers now falls on empty courtyards where only the wind moves freely through spaces once filled with purpose and urgency. But there's something profound in this emptiness, something that speaks to the deeper truth about what endures and what passes away. The walls themselves tell the story better than any chronicle. Run your hand along the stones, though you're only imagining this now, as your body settles deeper into rest, and you can feel the marks left by tools wielded by men whose names we'll never know. Each block was lifted into place by someone who understood weight, who knew the ache in shoulders and back that comes from carrying what feels too heavy, who learned the satisfaction of setting something down in exactly the right place, and knowing it would hold. The 1,000 steps still descend into darkness, though now they're lit by electric bulbs for the occasional guided tour. But in the deep hours of night, when the last visitor has departed and the mountain settles into its ancient quiet, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, soldiers moving supplies, messages being carried between the fortress and the world below, the steady rhythm of people doing what needed to be done, day after day, season after season. The chambers where men once slept now hold only shadows and the accumulated silence of centuries. But if you listen carefully, and your mind is growing quieter now, more receptive to subtleties, you might sense something of what they knew. That rest comes not from the absence of responsibility, but from the knowledge that you've carried your portion of the weight with dignity, that you've added your small contribution to something larger and more enduring than any individual effort. The fortress keeps its vigil as it always has, though what it guards now is different from what Vauban originally intended. It guards memory, the memory of what humans can accomplish when they commit to building rather than merely consuming, when they choose to carry difficult weight rather than seeking only comfort, when they understand that their daily struggles are part of a larger story that extends far beyond their own immediate concerns. In winter, snow covers the ramparts and fills the corners where sentries once stood watch. The fortress becomes a study in white and gray, stark and beautiful, against the mountain sky. The cold that once challenged soldiers and workers now serves only to preserve the stones, slowing the inevitable work of time and weather. And there's something deeply peaceful in imagining this. The fortress wrapped in winter silence, patient and enduring, requiring nothing from anyone, simply being what it was built to be. Spring brings wildflowers to the spaces between the stones, small bright spots of color that would have delighted the men who spent their days surrounded by granite and mortar. Life finds a way, as it always does, not competing with the human work, but complementing it, adding beauty to strength, softness to endurance. The fortress in spring reminds us that what we build can become part of the natural world, rather than standing in opposition to it. Summer fills the courtyards with golden light and brings visitors from around the world to walk where soldiers once drilled and workers once labored. Children run along the walls where cannons once pointed toward distant threats, their laughter echoing in spaces designed for more serious purposes. And perhaps this is the highest compliment the fortress could receive: to become a place where future generations can play safely, protected by walls built by men who understood the weight of defending what matters. But it's in the deep hours of night that Fort Liberia reveals its truest nature. When the last tour group has descended the mountain and the lights of Villefranche-de-Conflans twinkle far below like fallen stars, the fortress settles into a silence so complete it seems to have weight of its own. This is when you can feel most clearly what the builders achieved. Not just a military installation, but a place where human determination took physical form, where the decision to carry difficult weight became visible in stone and mortar. The stars that shine down on the fortress now are the same stars that watched over its construction 3 centuries ago. The constellations that guided Vauban's vision still wheel overhead, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, but somehow approving of the simple human decision to build something solid, something meant to last. Under these stars, the weight you carry in your own life begins to feel less burdensome, part of a pattern that extends across centuries, connecting you to everyone who has ever chosen to build rather than abandon, to persist rather than surrender. The mountain itself seems to breathe in the darkness, expanding and contracting with the temperature changes that come with night. And the fortress breathes with it, settling slightly, adjusting to the cold, but never yielding, never giving way. 300 years of nights have passed over these walls, 300 years of storms and calms, of seasons turning and returning, and still the fortress holds its position, patient and undemanding. In your mind's eye, let yourself see it as it is right now. This very moment, as you lie in your own bed, carrying your own concerns. The fortress stands in darkness, solid and certain, requiring nothing from anyone, simply existing as proof that difficult things can be built, that weight can be carried, that what seems impossible at the beginning can become, with patience and persistence, simply what is. The wind that moves through the empty gun ports and along the abandoned ramparts carries no urgency now. It speaks only of time passing and endurance rewarding those who commit to building something larger than their immediate comfort. It whispers of the satisfaction that comes not from avoiding difficulty, but from meeting it with steadiness and grace. And as your own breathing slows and deepens, matching the ancient rhythm of the mountain itself, you can feel something of what those builders knew, that the weight becomes lighter when it's carried with purpose, that the work becomes meaningful when it serves something beyond the self, that rest comes most completely to those who have spent their strength on something worthy of the effort. The fortress sleeps, if stones can be said to sleep, not the sleep of exhaustion, but the rest of completion, the deep satisfaction of work well done and purpose fulfilled. Its dreams, if it dreams, are of the hands that shaped it and the vision that guided its creation, of men who understood that building something to last requires accepting the weight of responsibility and carrying it day after day until the work is done. The darkness around Fort Liberia is not empty, but full of history and accomplishment, full of the accumulated weight of countless individual decisions to continue building despite difficulty, full of the quiet pride that comes from creating something that will outlast its creators. And in this fullness, in this deep satisfaction of work completed and purpose served, you can find your own rest, knowing that your efforts too are part of something larger, that the weight you carry serves a purpose beyond immediate understanding, that what you're building will endure long after tonight's concerns have faded into the gentle darkness where all completed work finally comes to rest, where all carried weight is at last set down, where the fortress stands eternal and patient under stars that have watched over builders and dreamers for countless centuries, holding space for your own rest in the vast and gentle silence of work well done and burdens faithfully carried.